November 16th. A fresh, clear, snappy morning. Almost like New England. The Red Cross nurses, passing my window early on the way to duty in the tents, huddle under their blue capes lined with red. The boys limp by to breakfast more briskly than usual. An aroma of American bacon makes me homesick for my journeys up and down the AEF. No more swift, cold drives in khaki-colored cars. No more marvelous American growths springing from the ancient French countryside. Impossible to realize that the armistice guns have shattered the AEF into bits. It had come to seem imperishable, a living creation. Yet the millions of men who made it live will soon be spread wide over the vast surface of the United States. Lost again in our grinding industrial cities, our tin-roofed western farms, our barren New England villages. I am forever asking myself what traces they will keep of their contact with Europe. They will all be marked, in one way or another. A good many will be lightly powdered with French earth, but only a few will find roots clinging to them, roots that will shrivel up or weep a European sap when inserted into the soil of Indiana or Maine. Maine, wasn't that where the first body of American soldiers I ever saw in France hailed from? The ones I happened upon in lean, brown, pastoral country that might of itself have been Maine. I had just come from Verdun, from the still beleaguered citadel, from a land sternly organized and scarred by war, and swarming with seasoned French troops. Then all at once here was the AEF. The first squad was drawn up for drill in a poor little peaceful, brown-tiled village. Service hats, that made them somehow look like Pilgrim Fathers, set squarely above red cheeks. Next, with unaccustomed helmets sliding at a rakish, almost a girlish angle, came a machine gun company convoying one lone machine gun along a wood road. In the willowy valleys and on the piney hillside, sparse groups of infantry. Could anything so innocent and unequipped as this transatlantic force of ours ever become an army trained to the 1918 arena? Ships landed without docks, warehouses built without wood, stores transported without cars. One learned of the fiber of America in a journey from the base ports to the Lorraine front. Carolina stevedores singing at their unloading in the crowded harbor of Saint-Nazaire. Negroes building railroad tracks. I saw 3 in Civil War uniforms, in sandy central France. Boys from Pennsylvania shunting freight cars. Say, you have to talk to this Injun in French, or she won't go. East Side Jews and Italians building depots. Foresters from the Pacific cutting and sawing for the Italians. Southern engineers building bridges. Cowboys from Colorado tying their mules in turreted French villages. Men from Minnesota sitting up in hospital cots northwest of Toul to describe in German-American the Boches they had done for. And then those masses of khaki I walked into by the Madeleine one listless July night when hope was low. A line of motor trucks extending as far down the dingy, deserted boulevard as the eye could reach, loaded with American guns, American supplies, American soldiers. Inexhaustible resources, inexhaustible vitality. Tears rise to the eyes of the quiet French population that gathers quickly out of the twilight. The American boys have such jolly, comical faces, so burned and ruddy, so black with dust, and with roses stuck in their hats and their rifles. At any moment may descend hot death, to shatter limbs, pulp, tear, blast, beloved soldiers who love rough life and breathe not less for dying, faithful to the last. Beloved soldiers, beloved Américains. Glasses and bottles are whisked out of cafes. Pretty little street girls swarming like bees, offering roses and kisses. Charming in the sense they have, yes, they too, have fine French feelings, these little girls, of the fine young American faith offered to save France. Les chers enfants, les braves, qu'ils viennent de loin. The dear boys, the heroes who came from so far. Yes, we were the only child-hearted people left in this racked and disillusioned Europe last July, and we came from far, far to tell the world. That was our greatest contribution to the Allied cause. We are young yet after the Argonne and the armistice, and now we are going far, far back again. Those poor boys think they're going to get home for Christmas, says Miss O from the window. I just wish they could. They're more restless already. It's true, there is something in the faces even of this small circle of wounded survivors, still dressed in unified olive drab, still moved by group emotion, reading Pershing's victory order in the Herald that shows a relaxation of the patient common purpose of the AEF. A new sort of discontent. The next months will in certain ways be harder than the war, more of a strain on morale. Pershing does well to sound a warning as to the dangers of victory. Pétain sounded it first. His order is the finer, for the French tongue lends itself to the expression of high emotion. History will celebrate the proud energy spent during these 4 years by our country which had to conquer in order not to die. You will not reply to the crimes which have been committed by a violence that might in the excess of your resentment seem legitimate. Having conquered your adversary by force of arms, you will further dominate him by the dignity of your attitude, and the world will not know which to admire more, your bearing in success or your heroism in combat. I wish Pétain had not used the word crimes. Why not? Since crime... Perhaps one wants the Allies too magnanimous to underline their magnanimity. Perhaps, when one has seen war at close quarters, words of civil justice lose their meaning. I was still pondering these questions this afternoon, when Miss O brought in a quasi-official French visitor, who, as it happens, had talked to me a great deal in the past about German crimes. Madame S., with whom last year, when she was acting as press guide for the French government in the war zone, I journeyed to Alsace and Verdun. She was eminently fitted for the job from the official standpoint. Well-born and bred, the daughter of a distinguished academician and novelist, flexible in talk, agreeable to travel with. Convinced of the necessity of spreading certain types of French ideas, yet handing them out in such homeopathic doses that most of the foreign ladies swallowed them quite unsuspecting. Slim and smart enough, too, and quite hard-headed enough to make a soft, feminine charm rather than a masculine grip. Her stock in trade, especially with the French. No sinecure to persuade an officier de carrière, career officer, to be receptive to American women journalists. I have a genuine sympathy for her, and she one for me, I believe, though she mistrusts my new republicanism as I mistrust her Catholic conservatism and her undefined but very definite foothold in the inner temple of French diplomacy. She came today to inquire for my wounds in the interest of the Quai d'Orsay. By the time she had praised my roses and acutely criticized my chrysanthemums, a bunch of gorgeous hothouse blooms, for their coldness, she had taken it in that I was accepting the fortunes of war without thought of blame. Whereupon she plunged into politics. To Madame S., November nth equals triumph over Germany. On les a! We have them. It sparkled in her black eyes, eyes quite wickedly pretty even on ordinary days, gave her penciled lips a special curve of vindictiveness, added verve to her delicate bird-like gestures. The armistice terms, she thinks, are duly hard. She is by no means convinced that France should not extend her boundaries to the left bank of the Rhine. Monsieur Berthelot is drawing up the statement of France's claims, and he can be trusted. Germany is defeated. Surely it is legitimate and natural that this stupendous fact should dominate the French intelligence just now. Yet there was something ominous about Madame S.'s exultation as she spoke of the Rhine, the flight of the Crown Prince to Holland, the abdication of Charles of Austria. Not the joy of a democrat in the democratic future of Europe. President Wilson's probable coming she mentioned with a certain reserve. The tone of the débat and the temps, as contrasted with the frank joy of la humanité. But she believed that once he had visited the devastated regions, he could not fail to realize. She, too, had been in the Paris streets on the day of the armistice. I found myself in the crowd between two wounded officers. Chasseurs alpins they were. One of them, a captain, had such an attractive face that I asked him if he were feeling happy. Yes, we're glad of victory. But what grieves us, my friend and me, is not to have been able to stay at the front to the end. Only a month ago that we were wounded. No luck. Then she told the story of a marquis, the owner of a great estate north of Verdun, who arrived there in his officer's uniform on November 11th, before the Germans had gone, to the alarm of the tenants. Attention, monsieur le marquis, les Boches sont là. Take care, sir, the Jerrys are there. Don't worry, my good friends, and he retired triumphantly to sleep in his dog kennels, leaving the Germans in his house for a last unhappy night. Chasseur alpin and marquis. A very different France, hers, from that of the poet's Republican vignettes. Madame S. paints her country much as the charming French officers who came to America in the spring of 1917 represented her to us, in a glamour of horizon blue. I shall always have a weakness for horizon blue. But I can't be too thankful that I never wrote, under Madame S.'s guidance, the sort of propagandist article approved by the Affaires étrangères. In her heart she respects me for not having done it, though she regards propaganda as entirely legitimate. Propaganda! Whether German, British, French, or American, it appears to me a giant bugbear, sitting hard on the chest of the world. I am so depressed by a glance at the censored evening papers after Madame S.'s departure that my nurse suggests a chapter from Willa Cather's new novel, My Antonia. She loves the book herself, for it takes her back to the farm and the villages she drives to over the treeless, windy roads of North Dakota. And I, through the magic of these very simple words, lose myself, too, in blonde corn fields, in miles of copper-red grass drowned in fierce sunlight, in a free, frank, grassy country which, as the author says, seems to be running. I see it running from the Franco-American spells evolved by the complex brains of the Rue François Première. How inaccessible to such spells, if the complex brains only knew, are Americans like this placid girl sitting beside me. Thousands of American soldiers of her species. She descends from the blonde, isolated cornfields as I descend from nobly New England pastures overlooking the sea that washes Europe, the sea that keeps the tongues of Latin Europe haunting in my ears and throws a mirage of its storied cities before my eyes. Nothing in Miss O washes, reflects Europe, at least Latin Europe. If she strikes a self-respecting course through the dark mysteries of Neuilly, that is due to sheer character, such character as her Norwegian father showed in guiding his prairie schooner into the Dakotan wilds. Duty is her guiding star, duty to me, whom she admirably accepts as her patient, though she made a real sacrifice to come across plain and ocean to France to nurse wounded soldiers. I have ever so many more points of contact with the little French nurses who do things for me during her hours off. Yet, have I? It rests me enormously just now to see her sitting there cozily in her ugly gray sweater, as impermeable to the subtleties of my late visitor as one of those nice, friendly prairie dogs, beloved of Antony. Always the vibration between wanting visitors to give me vicarious life and knowledge again, and hating them because they hurt my still peace. Each new figure in the pattern of my days tinkles sharply against my silence and my pain, as a bit of colored glass drops into its place in a kaleidoscope. But by evening suffering and pattern merge, and I am fused with both. Sunday, November Sunday, November 17th. French gentlemen have got out their high hats today for the first time since 1914, in honor of the first official celebration of victory. An Alsace-Lorraine procession down the Champs-Élysées to the statues of Metz and Strasbourg. The city's no longer in mourning, soon to be entered by the French troops. Another lonely fight celebration for me, but I had one dear visitor, Lucinda, pale, exhausted, all eyes under the night blue veil. I shall be so sorry, for aesthetic reasons, to have her give up. She looks about at the end of her tether. The climax of her intense effort of service has been reached in these last days, among the worst they have had at Blake's. Mostly men wounded on the 11th itself. She has a patient, a wonderful boy, blinded at 10 o'clock that day. At 11 o'clock on the 11th, a number of the hospital staff, nurses, and doctors were gathered in a small room downstairs about the coffin of a much-loved patient, a boy whom they had tried desperately to save and who had won all their hearts. The victory guns and bells sounded through his burial service. Lucinda says that she went to the window afterwards in a sort of daze. She saw people across the way putting out flags. They had a strange expression on their faces, as if it wasn't true. "That's the way I felt myself," said the poor child. For months she has lived, as much as any young infantry officer, with the immense sacrifice, suffering, heroism of the doughboys. She has dressed their shocking wounds, used every resource of her being to bring them back to life, watched by them as they died calling for their mothers, calling her mother. And from this consecration, this sense of the constant company of the dead whose lives are the stuff of victory, she emerged on Armistice Night into streets like New York on election night. No exaltation, no prayer, no knowledge of what I had left in the hospital on any face. Only self-indulgence, excess, stupid rejoicing, drunken officers, always this chorus. While the war lasted, the excitement and necessity of it kept you going. But now you can't help wondering if it had to be, why it had to be, whether the world will be the better for it. She looked at me questioningly, but I have no reassurance to offer. Even if I had, this jeune fille bien élevée, elegant young lady, Lucinda was preeminently the American equivalent of the term a year ago, would not accept it at second hand, after her months of very fundamental first-hand experience. Miss O went to a service tonight, and one of the Alsatian sisters got me ready for the sleep that never comes. She had been to the procession, in which the other sister marched in costume, and says the crowds, though very reverential, were also unmanageable, sweeping away all the barriers and making hay of police regulation, to the joy of the American soldiers, perched on guns, statues, and Tuileries treetops. The crowd was further harrowed and thrilled by the airplanes, flocks, droves of them that came darting and wheeling down from the Arc de Triomphe, doing the most breathless stunts to meet clouds and coveys of pigeons set free in the Concorde. All this in the blue November haze with a tinge at the end of sunset gold, the colors of the Paris late autumn and of Puvis de Chavannes, Saint Geneviève, and afterwards a victory Te Deum, celebrated at Notre Dame. I can forego the procession, but what a hunger I have for those rolling chants, those Gothic spaces, those prayers of anguish and thanksgiving. November 18th. The French troops are advancing into Lorraine. They will probably enter Metz tomorrow. In time I shall hear of it from F.T. The Herald, so very anti-Wilson, has today a patronizing editorial eulogy of our president, which ends by insisting, in Madame S.'s manner, on the value of his visit to the devastated regions. I am sure he ought to see them. Yet if these scarcely veiled suggestions that he does not know what the Boche really is like are not dropped, he will feel as rebellious as I do when asked to write a dictated, the French word tendanceau has no good English equivalent, article. Arthur Rule's account of his visit to Alsace comes back to me. He was so thoroughly and officially guided that he got no chance to talk to the natives. Finally, he succeeded in dashing alone into a tobacconist's and stammered out to the old woman, "Do you want to belong to Germany or France?" "To neither," she replied with spirit. That is a story one should not remember just now, for comfort. November 19th. Rick has reappeared, as large as life and twice as casual, surprised and sorry that I have worried about him. Didn't think about wiring or writing, since he was okay. He does not retreat to the corner this time. Stands a moment, taking me in from his well-balanced height. Remarks dubiously that I look better and very clean. He is thinking of the wounded at the front with their ghastly smooched faces. Then disposes himself astride one of the stiff chairs by my bed. "Well, here you are, after all, mon cher." A flash of responsive affection from the very depths of his reserve. Good. He wanted the assurance that I am glad he is alive, especially as he doesn't know whether to be glad or sorry for himself. But his next look hopes I am aware that this is a rotten anticlimax after so many heroic farewells to life. Now what? The light dies out of his voice and his eyes. He is going home very soon. They will release him on his mother's account. Offered him a job in Paris. What's the point after the front? Naturally, it would be pleasant. Too pleasant. So many pleasant times in Paris in the last 2 years and a half. Town already not what it was during the war. Of course, there's Poland, and Russia, and the Balkans. All sorts of openings for action and adventure. This with a sigh and thickening gloom. Every temptation to stay on and on. Don't you do it, Rick. If you go home now, you'll always have the best of the two worlds. If you stay, you'll turn into a rolling stone on both continents. But I realize how hard it's going to be, after so long. His dark, concentrated gaze inquires whether I do realize. Have you cabled? Have survived the war. Please send $500 against return. An 18-year-old twinkle at the recollection. That will convince Mother. The squadron thought it was a great idea, trying to grind out sentimental family telegrams. On the strength of cheerful reminiscence, he takes a comfortable stretch to the iron crossbar of the bed with his beautiful 300-franc boots. His are not, alas, the first military boots for which that bar has had a fatal attraction, and the contriteness of the culprit is almost worse than the jar to my fractured ankles. Got the news of the armistice at the squadron the night before. Picked up by wireless. By the colonel's orders, it was announced at the Y. The officers threw their chairs through the moving picture screen. The men proceeded to blow up everything in sight. Stole all the bombs and flares, piled them in the road, and set them off by a system of electric wiring, with terrific effect. Everybody on the loose. My mechanic accidentally ran into the squadron adjutant. He jumped aside and saluted, but the adjutant yelled, "To hell with that stuff, the war's over." The colonel ended by putting the whole camp under arrest. The news produced in the flight commander a fierce desire for liquor. Commandeered the YMCA Ford and scoured the country. When he got back, though, with a case of champagne, neither he nor anyone else wanted it. The new men, who had never been across, and were cheated out of their war, went to bed. The old men sat up, half-heartedly. In the morning we listened for the guns, heard them, wondered if we'd be sent out, weren't. Though it was perfect flying weather, pouring rain. We were playing chess at the time hostilities ceased. Somebody gave a whoop. That was all. In the afternoon the colonel graciously pardoned us, read a report on the valorous exploits of the squadron. At this, gloom thickens again. I am to know that the war came to an end just too soon for my young friend. Recommended for a captaincy. Been promised a squadron of his own, In another month, would have been a major and a CO. Another month! A rather wry smile responds to my protesting tone. Oh well, he didn't get his month. Just as he never got his chance to go out with the French. Did I remember all the months he waited? All the false alarms of orders? And now, after the last disappointment, he went up and did such suicidal acrobatics in a heavy old brigand that he was nearly put under arrest? There could be no heroes, could there? He continued after a pause. If man really had a sense of humor. Nothing I undertake seriously, but the gods turn it to farce. I give you my word. The war is the biggest farce of all. Why will people stay so long? That boy haunts me. He is so completely out of a job and sees nothing ahead but moral responsibility, from which he shrinks as much as he courts physical danger. Superficially, the world is his oyster. He takes daily life with delightful ease and buoyancy. He is having a good time now, disporting himself, so far as a clean-minded, vigorous Western American can, in the elaborate manner prescribed by Paris to drown care, for the conscious or unconscious purpose of ignoring and repressing his doubt of himself. The doubt that he may not make good in real life as he has made good as a flyer. At heart he knows the worth of his own stuff and metal, yet he is afraid that his vaulting ambition will peter out when no longer backed by the violent incentive of risking the neck. Yes, he is seriously out of a job, now it is all over. And despite his zest for action, he has a literary temperament. He never acts, but he reacts on his action, on paper. Don't I know? Always plumbing his still waters and adding himself up, especially in his letters. His friendship for me is little more than a peg on which to hang his conclusions. I happen to be near, and he must disclose to somebody the black turmoil of his spirit. Too much responsibility for me as I lie here on this helpless bed. The dark whirls so fast that I can't even get things clear. I have no job to offer him on a silver salver. How shall I convince him? Conflicts of peace. They generate the creative impulse as war generates the destructive. He can't stop fighting. He must create. Write his adventures and his doubts into books. It will need, my friend, the best of your brain and your nerve. November 20th. For the first time since my arrival, nearly a month ago, I was lifted, just now, onto a stretcher so that my mattress might be turned, to ease the strained, stiff back on which I must continue to lie. Miss M., the kind head nurse, and as Irish and dark as her assistant Miss G. is Saxon and fair, directed 3 nurses in the job. They were almost more nervous than I. The horror of having my left foot touched. On the days of dressings, my dread begins long before light. Again in my fresh, level bed, but they forgot to take out the grinding ache at the bottom, I suddenly realize, as Miss M's tired face vanishes out of the door, the weight of responsibility she carries. Realize with compunction how deep in individualism I have sunk, shut up so safe here in my gray cell. I know, and dread, the patient in the next room by her cough which comes hoarsely through the wall. I know the one overhead by the quick, trotting step of her nurse. But all the other horizontal shapes are nebulous. Suddenly their need of medicine, dressings, thermometers, hot water bags, becomes vivid to me. I wonder, do they accept these sacramental hospital attentions as a matter of course? Or do they marvel, as I, though fallen from the grace of unanimisme, still marvel at this avaricious hoarding and cherishing of the breath of life that so extraordinarily contradicts the squandering of war? They may not think so much as I do about the breath of life. They may be rolled in coma, or restlessly tossed, like skiffs moored in a stormy harbor. For me, too little coma. I am always stringing my heart to courage and persistence. It keeps me stern. Pauvre ami, said A.S. the other day, vous avez un air que je ne connais pas, un air si sévère. My poor friend, you have an air about you, I don't know, a really severe air. I'm impressed that she did not describe the two new nurses at length. I mean, all we got there was very, very basic descriptions of them. I guess they weren't hot. Have we seen any consistent details that tell us what her type is? Their eye game. Oh, that's true. Maybe she has a thing for eyes, and if they don't have pretty eyes. Yep, I'm seeing the pattern. I wish I could identify Lucinda, because then we would have probably three photographs to compare. Dark circles around their eyes. Like a raccoon or an insomniac or both. Hmm? Very subtle. So subtle. All right, November 22nd is going to be a bit longer. And it has some footnotes. We get a few interesting. November 22nd. One great imaginative picture we shall keep of this war that has been so poor in ceremony and circumstance, the surrender of the German fleet. The newspapers are full of it today, and even they, with their debased verbal currency, can't cheat the spectacle of its terror and romance and retribution. Watching those German battleships sailing, single file, into the British lines in captivity, I felt for the first time a thrill of victory. Down goes the German colossus into great dark waters, with a splash that rocks my bed. And as the waters grow calm and blue again, the British Empire appears, floating serene on their crest. Gibraltar, Africa, Egypt, India, Australia, Canada. Fabulous names, encircling the world. All that Britain has done through the war, her courage and fortitude and inarticulate determination, her very blunders and stupidities, seem compensated by the mastery of the sea this day affirms. Yet Wilson proposes to change mastery into freedom, freedom even for the prostrate colossus. This opens too large a window on the world and the peace conference to be comfortable for one's shivering intelligence. My nurse regrets that I have had no visitor on this historic day. I did have one, quite as real as if she had come in flesh and blood from London to sit beside me in the grey afternoon light, so that we might try to puzzle out together, in disjointed fashion, how closely the cooperation of the armies and the fleets, which today's events substantiated, had really linked American and English understanding. I am always intensely conscious, she said, that Wilson will be the chief figure at the peace conference. Practically all Europe and England will have to submit to his dictation, and a great many won't like it. And a certain proportion of the group are the men who best represent what great things a great England has stood for. They will not respond to his moral idealism where material and practical advantage are concerned any more than they have responded to America's militant ardor during the past year. We in England had suffered too long and too deeply. Yet how lucky that America could generate sufficient ardor to take the wonderful stand she did. It was, I answered, chiefly with lack of ardor that the American troops reproached the British with whom they were brigaded. They had been trained and nourished in an atmosphere of enthusiasm and they encountered a frost. Tea instead of coffee, and a frost. Yes, she replied. I have been going to a large American hospital twice a week as Red Cross visitor. The men suffer so pluckily. I am melted with appreciation and affection for them. When they get up, they drift to us for a cup of tea and fill every nook and cranny of the house with an insidious breeze from America. Their criticism of the familiar type of British officer is racy enough. They vaguely strive to do him a little more justice than their prejudices encourage or allow. But the deep and great entente of the press hardly assumes more impressive shape than this to the objective eye. Isn't that, I insisted, somewhat the fault of the whole British military policy of deliberate separation and detachment? I can't tell you how remote England and the British front have felt to me during this last year in France. Almost more so than they felt in America. From the moment I landed in Bordeaux, the war as it concerned France and America was interpenetrated, crudely actual. The Franco-American entente was a thing of deeds, not words. But the British-American remained vague and literary. Just because the British Army, in spite of a certain number of British officers in Paris streets and restaurants, remained physically and psychologically far away, like something written in a war book. What changed my own feeling, I went on to say, was the appearance, toward the end of last July, in the courtyard of the Hôtel de France et Choiseul, of a young officer in the uniform of the Royal Field Artillery. A little Anglo-American whom I fancy you know well. He looked extraordinarily, touchingly young to me, though he bore himself with an easy grace that seemed his natural approach to life. We sat down together at an iron table. He chose a Benedictine in the interest of sophistication, though it should have been a citronade, for the day was warm. Then, with a happy, humorous, philosophic smile that recalled his Scotch father, and took me straight back to certain games of slapjack into which a carrot-headed, freckled, argumentative little boy of 9 put much zest, he began to talk of his rediscovery of America. Boys in the AEF, girls, such charming girls, in the ARC, their names were echoes from distant American years, and his interest in them had a gleam of his mother's sensitive appraisals. He was eager, delighted with both America and Paris, with Paris, which he was seeing for the first time, partly because it was so American, and partly because it was so French. So living, so spacious, so very beautiful. So much more than London, he said. The heart of the world and the war. Already he felt that he belonged here, whether rolling like a prince in a taxi-cab up the joyful luxury of the Champs-Élysées, following sundry extravagant purchases on the boulevard Haussmann, or eating en plein air, outdoors, in Montmartre, with golf kids after Poulbeau begging for sous, broad-hatted, cadaverous types out of Louise stalking by, and Monsieur le Patron in a little black velvet cap and an enormous beard, playing on an espace de guitare. His appreciation had a freshness and a nostalgic enchantment that I put down to the American blood in his veins, as well as to relief from the front, the rather tiresome front to which he must return when his precious week was over, the British front. Before he had finished his little golden glass, it had taken on as sharp and dreadful an actuality for me as the front where Rick was bombing. In those masses, in that lurid and booming region shadowed by disaster, I should now see one individual figure, individual yet symbolic of a great risk and a great hope. My friend speaks at last. Or do I just imagine her voice, coming so dim out of the dark? The armistice has brought no news of Stuart. He has been missing since the end of September. 14 months since he left for France and the same regiment in which his elder brother was killed in the Battle of the Somme. Left feeling glad that he was old enough to do his part. Though he hated war and had the happy, reasonable, harmonious nature, the vital approach to life which seems to hold the key. War was in no sense his destiny, as it had somehow seemed Morton's destiny. No, whether Stuart comes back or not, I shall never associate him with that grim lunar landscape where his brother, still borne up by the heroic emotion of the first years, met the end that his temperamental restlessness sought and made fitting. Morton belongs in one of those poignant graves, overgrown with straggling roses and tucked about the half-ruined apse of a French Gothic church in some wholly ruined French village of the Somme. But Stuart, I refuse to connect with tragedy the connoisseur of Chateau Yquem. I always drink Chateau Yquem, said he, with an air of initiation which secretly enchanted his beloved trio of girls at the Hôtel des Champs-Élysées, the host at a loge at the Français, and how he did appreciate the perfect art and tender Gallic irony of Bouberoche, the companion of my walk in Vieux Paris. I shall think of him, rather, as haunting always those beautifully proportioned 17th-century rooms of the Musée Carnavalet, which a guardian, drowsing in the July stillness of the courtyard, had the discernment to open for his benefit. Emptied of their treasures since the German advance, they were all the more full of Madame de Sévigné and her friends for that, shades exquisitely welcoming to the si gentil, so sweet, and responsive young foreigner, whose answering salutation gave them the assurance they needed, the assurance that it was worthwhile for an Anglo-Saxon to risk death to save such monuments of the French creative mind as this. That he faced death lightly indeed and keenly, without phrases or self-pity, like all the best of his generation. He talked to me on the way home, I remember, about the French girls, the sort who wear paint and powder and dark circles under their eyes. Aesthetically, they were rather displeasing in their pervasiveness, and he had discovered that Americans, in their revolt from Puritan tradition, gave them too much attention. Sometimes one amused oneself by imagining what a Paris leave might be if one found a nice French girl to go about with. There were nice ones in the number, who would never have chosen that life but for the war. Still, no relation could be so delightful, so wonderful really, as this he was discovering with American girls of his own kind. There was a freedom and charm and equality about it. He wished his sister could know those three girls, so animated and cordial and intelligent to talk to, so different from English girls. He was looking forward to the last evening. He had arranged a surprise. When they came up from dinner to the salon, there would be 3 bouquets, one for each, the best Paris could produce to express his thanks for the way they had taken him into a home from home. I tried before his mother faded into the dark to give her an impression of his parting smile. It was really meant for her, who should have been in my place. The only blot on this last rapturous week was, he said, that she did not share it. November 23rd. A certain amount of bad pain may be good for the moral character. I may as well think so, though I don't really believe in purgatory. But pain prolonged is degeneration, not purgation. I am losing, coin by coin, the last of the treasure of patience I have been so carefully hoarding. It has reached the point that I want to remove the head of anyone who merely walks boldly across my floor, thereby causing a faint vibration of my iron bed, which at once communicates itself to my hyper-responsive ankle. I have learned, among my pillows, an art of timid stillness that would give points to a mummy. At moments, as after dressings, it seems quite too perilous to take a long breath. The reaction of the medical and nursing entourage to suffering whose prolongation they see no good reason for, as the infection is clearing up and the fractures presumably knitting, is interesting. Colonel Lambert meets it as a medical man, with specific remedies. He disapproves heartily of my wasting away on hospital chicken broth. Dr. M, who hates suffering, meets it as a surgeon by keeping out of my room save when he is led here for a dressing by one of the nurses who rule his days. Miss O is very sympathetic that I can't enjoy the hothouse fruit provided by kind friends, but turns prickly when a spasm comes. Irritated with herself, I suspect. She is so good and conscientious, because she has not been able to prevent it. A certain gentle, kinky-haired, red-cheeked English night nurse with a Cockney accent is the only person who can really arrange my fracture pillows. I begin to understand the New Testament when, after 2 hours, sometimes of weary waiting for her, I feel her healing touch. She has charge of the babies who occasionally come into the world on the top floor, and this morning, against all law and order, she brought one in to me, at the pallid and cynical hour of 2. A Swedish baby about 3 weeks old which, when unrolled from its warm, sweet-smelling blankets, blinked wisely at the light. A miracle of a baby, complete in every detail, not a bone missing. What saves me is that I am, even in my worst hours, more concerned with life and its mysteries than with the dikes that fate has built to hem it in and hinder its flow. But sometimes I am aware what a vicarious version of life I am getting, all through other people's eyes. Even the baby was held up at a distance. I am impatient to touch life again, to feel it swirling hard against my own body. Life took me at my word. I am still shaken from head to foot by the shock of immersion. Dr. M, more regardful than Miss O, and I gave him credit for, appeared to announce my immediate departure to No. 1 to be X-rayed. Before I knew it, the revolution was accomplished. A stretcher with several friendly privates to hoist it had invaded my domain from the garden, and I was lying in an ambulance with keen outdoor air, how rough to the nostrils, rushing in at the open end, and a blurred vision of Neuilly flowing along behind. Comfortable, high, brick, bourgeois mansions draped above their discreet gardens in the flags of victory. The ambulance boy did his best for me. I never went so slow before. But the jolting was excruciating on these boulevards rutted so deeply by 4 years of ambulances. It took no more than one jolt to translate me again into unanimisme. The sensation of being translated into the body of a soldier, and into the system in which he lives and moves and has his being, was further borne out as follows. A. Irksome delay at the door. B. Hot altercation between ambulance boy and sergeant in charge. The former claims that this entrance will save the patient. The latter knows his orders, so we eventually jolt along to the other one. C. Appearance on the steps, as the stretcher is taken out, of 2 or 3 pretty nurses' aides of our best New York families, who gather around, blankets envelope me, and a grey hood like a monk's cowl falls over my head, inquiring in tones whose imperious and patronizing ring make me squirm with indignity, who this poor dear boy is, etc. D. Journey the whole length of the hospital on a jiggly stretcher cart, to an elevator that isn't running. Journey the whole distance back to another that goes up only 2 stories. Thereafter, journey the same distance back again to a long flight of stairs up which I am carried at an angle of 45 degrees to the X-ray room. E. Interim. Endless wait by the second elevator, man having his lunch, in a corridor full of French femmes de service who are carrying lunch trays to the wards. Unimaginable clatter of dishes, chatter of 10,000 magpies. The new patient intrigues the magpies, especially the youngish specimens, and they close in 2 or 3 deep about the stretcher cart, gazing at the drawn features under the cowl with tilted, frizzed heads and loving, pitying, languorous looks that stifle like a heavy perfume. Suddenly one soft creature gives away the show. On dirait une femme. You'd say it was a woman, she breathes. It is a woman, I answer furiously. The ranks simply melt. The X-ray itself, a skillful doctor in charge, was the least part of the business. But by the time the process A, B, C, D, E, etc. had been gone through in reverse order, from the top floor on the Boulevard Inkerman to the ground floor on the Rue Chavot, I was in a state of acute and agonized exhaustion. There promised to be another wait before I could be moved from the stretcher to the bed. Nurses, at lunch. But there I spoke up, in the manner of Queen Elizabeth or Amy Lowell, and demanded that the stretcher boys put me at once into the flat, still, waiting bed. They were only too ready to help, but Miss O was fearfully shocked. I then demanded, in the voice of Julius Caesar or Napoleon, a hypodermic. It came too, and quickly. Pity I didn't discover earlier how thoroughly it pays to lose one's self-control. And with it a young French nurse with sweet ways and piquant looks, who reminded me of my old friend Annie Wood, and who held my hand while the Red Cross nurse, who never holds my hand, we are far too reserved together, had some lunch. The afternoon was haunted by solicitous faces disappearing into space, and by a queer, faint voice, not at all a royal voice, pleading for silence and solitude. Please don't let them come in. Draw the curtains closer. Send them away. Don't let anyone take me out of bed. A pitiable figure of a unanimist I make now.